Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to what I think I'm as excited as everybody else that's connecting up into this webinar. Lindsay had mentioned to me that we have over 1,000 people that have registered for this, our webinar on demystifying the science behind the MCSE. And so I think there's a lot of people out there that are pretty interested in finding out, well, just what actually goes on in the development of an exam, a certification, an entire program like what we've come to know as that Microsoft certification. My name is Greg Shields, and as Lindsay mentioned, I am a author evangelist here with Pluralsight, and it is my great pleasure to, here in just a minute, bring on Liberty Munson, a principal psychometrician for Microsoft Technical Certification, and an individual whom I think you will find is full of lots of interesting and otherwise secret information. I want to kick off just a minute just to start with just the idea of how all of us here have gone through this process of sitting in front of a machine, trying to deal with these questions, trying to answer the questions, and every so often you get to one where you just sit dumbfounded. You prepare for that exam. You sit and try to figure out what the technologies are. You deconstruct the different objectives and tasks that exist in every Microsoft certification exam. Then you sit down and you get that question. You know, the one where you just think, what in the world were they thinking? So I think all of us are here in part to try to understand what was Microsoft thinking in the development of some of these questions, and then the development of a curriculum itself that tests the fact that we know what we say that we know. Here, I think we're going to have an opportunity to not only just talk with Liberty here in just a second, but also recognize two very important points. And these are the 2 points I think you take with you as you exit this webinar here today. The first of which is recognizing that, well, taking a Microsoft exam is difficult. Well, we know that. We've probably sat for one or more of them in our careers. But one thing that's interesting that I've learned already in the couple of initial conversations I've had with Liberty is that, in fact, authoring the exam is perhaps even harder. And that's one of the main takeaways that I want to at least have, or at least learn for myself as we talk here with Liberty. Liberty, thanks so much for spending some time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Liberty, the first question I think in everybody's mind is, why are the MCSE questions so difficult? why are they so hard?
They are hard because we want to be able to make the certification mean something. It should differentiate you from people who don't have that certification. We want to make it a challenge, but when you get done, it's a good challenge that you have demonstrated that you know something about Microsoft's technology and you're able to answer those questions, and it really sets you apart.
There sort of seems to be kind of a balance between, on one hand, if you make the exam too easy, well, people will be able to obtain it, but then it's not really worth the paper it's written on. But if you make the exam a little bit more difficult, then it requires us to have to go through that effort and that brain-numbing process of learning the different objectives and tasks for the exam. But the end result of which is a better MCSE, am I right?
That is the goal, is that we really want people who have our certifications to have differentiated themselves, to go above and beyond, and not everyone can earn a Microsoft certification, and so as a result it means something that you got certified and somebody else wasn't able to. It does mean that you have a higher level of skill and knowledge around our technology, and that's what we want. We want to create that value for people who take the time to get certified that really differentiates them from others.
So for those of you that are following along in the audience, I have exactly 0 additional slides here for our presentation with Liberty. I want to focus instead on just a conversation between her and I. So if you do have questions, there is an Ask a Question box somewhere on your screen where if you got any things you want to ask either myself or probably more for Liberty, drop it in that Ask a Question box and we'll see if we can get as many of them answered as we can in the time that we have. Okay, so enough of the softball questions. I've got some really interesting ones and perhaps some challenging ones here for you. Number one, what does a psychometrician actually do?
So my job is actually to make sure that our exams continue to be valid and reliable measures of the content domain. It all starts with development, so I make sure that we follow the right exam development process to make sure that we're asking the right questions and have the right content on the exam. And then once we have the questions written, that they're actually performing from a psychometric perspective. Are they at the right difficulty level? Do they differentiate between high and low performers? and then some other statistics that get into a little bit deeper. But fundamentally, I want to make sure that these are the right questions in terms of their difficulty and their ability to differentiate candidates. Then I also want to make sure that the items are actually asking the right questions, covering the right content. And to do that, I look at the comments that candidates provide when they take the exam. And so based on those comments, we actually do a comment review with our content development managers and subject matter experts to make a determination on if whatever was raised in the comment is actually something that we need to take action on to ensure that the content is at the right level and is appropriate for the exam. Then once the exam is published is actually where my real day job starts, is making sure that every one of our exams continues over its life to be a valid and reliable measure. So I spend a lot of time looking at the psychometrics, the statistics of how items and exams are performing. Then I also we're constantly being challenged to develop more content more quickly for less money, just like everybody else in the world is challenged to do more with less. So how can we change the development process? How can we change the sustainment process? How can we innovate and drive better quality content with the limited budget and time that we have? This has actually become even more of a challenge for us as Microsoft technologies start changing more rapidly, because there's a certain amount of time that it's always going to take to write a good question. And is Microsoft's technology changing so fast, can we keep up, and how do we do that? So I spend a lot of time looking at numbers. I love numbers, a lot of data, a lot of statistics, and I also spend a lot of time just talking with my team and strategizing about how we can develop content more quickly, and have more innovation, and think about how the certification industry is changing and how we can lead the way.
You brought up a really good point there about the comments, because I think all of us who have sat for a Microsoft exam have looked at that list of comments and thought, I really want to say something, but is it ever really going to get heard? And that's one thing it kind of hardens me, the fact that Microsoft does actually take those comments and does a full review on them. But I can imagine that in the thousands of people that are attempting to do a certification at any point in time, that you're going to get just an overwhelming number of comments. Is there a best practice to, if I should put a comment in there, that would ensure or have a better chance of that comment being heard?
So you should always comment. If you really think something is wrong with an item or you have concerns about it, you need to let me know, because we don't know what we don't know. So the kinds of comments that I'm looking for are things that are this question does not have a correct answer, and here's why. This question is technically inaccurate, and here's why. This question has more than one correct answer, and here's what they are. So as long as you're specific and it's really about the technical accuracy, the clarity, what is in and of the item itself, those are the comments that I really pay attention to. So those are the comments that I'm looking for. I do like the comments that say "Hi Liberty." They always make me chuckle. I often get a comment that's something like, "Hi Liberty, this question sucks because," which is fine. The comments that are actually less useful to me, though, are the ones where someone is explaining why they selected the option that they did, because I don't always understand if that means there's an issue with the question or if they're just trying to explain their thinking. And so sometimes I don't know what to do with those kinds of comments. But I read every single comment that we get on beta exams, because those are the ones where we have new content and we're really trying to understand what is going on with the item and if it's actually performing well and if it's clear and if technically accurate and things like that. On our live exams, we do have to take a slightly different approach, because we have about 125 Microsoft technical exams in market, not counting Dynamics exams or MOS or our technical associate exams. We have about 125 of those exams in market, so I clearly can't read all of those comments. So what we do is we actually have a rule that goes in and looks for items that have more than 25 comments, and then we get an email whenever there's an item on an exam where that happens. So it's a rolling 6-month period, so once a month I get an email that says, here's all of the exams and all of the items that have more than 25 comments. And then what I do is I work with my content development team to actually go in and look at those comments to figure out if there's issues with the item that need to be changed. And issues run the gamut from there's a typo, and we get a lot of comments about typos, and please continue giving me those comments because we want to fix those typos, to the technical accuracy of the question and clarity. So that's kind of how we manage the live exams and the comments that candidates provide. which is why if you have a comment about an item, you should provide it, because that's the way I'm going to see it, is once it gets that 25 limit, then the more people who see the issue comment on it, the more likely we are to see it and take action.
I've got a beautiful question that came in. One of the first questions that came in out of the gate from Amy. I'm going to adjust your question just a bit, Amy. Her question had to do with just the amount of time that, is there an appropriate amount of time that is planned for and preparing for an MCSE? But I want to adjust it just a bit in that when you're building a certification exam, do you take into account an amount of time that a person would need to study for passing an exam, or what is your determination in terms of what the bounds are going to be for any particular exam?
So we actually don't really consider preparation and how long it might take someone to prepare in terms of the content. We think more of it along the lines of what are the skills what is the level of certification we want to assess, or what's the level of skills that we want to assess? What's the certification going to mean? If it's an associate, what are the basic skills that we think that someone who has an MCSA in Windows Server should have? What should they have? And then once they get to the MCSE, what is the level of skills that they should have? So if you look at the audience profiles, you will see the types of experiences that candidates should have before they sit an exam or sit for or to earn a certification. And that's really what we focus on. And because every person is going to be different in the amount of time it takes for them to have that set of experiences. If someone's been working on Windows Server for years, odds are when we do a new certification or we update a certification, they probably will end up spending less time in preparation because they've already had the skills and experiences, versus someone who's brand new who will probably take more time. In the past, we've had years of experience as provided as kind of a guidance, but we found that doesn't always work, especially with new technologies, because when we release a new technology, how can someone have 3 years of experience? But we're
right.
trying to the idea behind, the reason why we're trying to do that was just to give you a feel for how much experience in general you would have to have in terms of with the product to be in the right place, to have had experience with most of the skills, to have done most of the tasks we have listed in the objective domain. So we really think about it more in terms of when someone says they're certified, they have an MCSA or MCSE, what is it that we want them to be able to do that has meaning, that sets them apart, that makes the certification valuable? Those are the skills that we go for. And then preparation is really based on that set of experiences that you need to have to be able to sit the exam and do well.
So we here at Pluralsight have been building and are continuing to build, and in fact I am actively building just today more assistive training courses to help people with passing these exams. And one of the things that I've been focusing on lately in an attempt to help people just understand what they need to focus on is really drilling down into the independent tasks associated with each objective. And I found it kind of funny when you actually kind of deconstruct the objective domain, when you start looking at those individual objectives and even further into the tasks themselves, Microsoft provides you provide a pretty good sense of what's going to be on that exam based off of the words that are in those individual tasks and objectives. Can you talk a bit about, even with the soft words, like the differentiation between the gerunds that you're using and the other words that are in there, are those a good indicator for the kinds of questions that you might see, or the style of questions you might see on any particular exam?
So that's definitely the goal with the words that we use, is to help prepare you for the types of questions that we will ask, even the question format that we'll likely use around a particular topic. But it's really more of a guideline to the item writers, and when we give them the objective domain and we assign them objectives to write to, we really want the content to drive the item type, though, or the item format. So unfortunately, we're still trying to figure out how to do performance-based testing and do it well. So a lot of the words that we use somehow can imply that it's going to be kind of a performance-based assessment of the skill, but we haven't quite nailed performance-based testing. We continue to investigate and invest in that, and I'm sure in some point in the future, hopefully the near future, we will have a solution for that. But until then, we look at different, more interactive item types to kind of get the same, to measure a skill without going truly performance-based. So So as an example, there might be something where you have to interact with an active screen because how do you configure something? So we're going to give you the user interface that you would go in and configure it, and so you have to go in and click the boxes and make the right selection so you can configure something to meet certain requirements. So we try to get at some of the more interactive nature of some of the verbs that we use when we're describing the skills through those kinds of item formats. But it is really more of a guideline because we want the content to drive the item type that's selected. So we don't want to force something just because people want to do, we don't want to force something into an active screen or a build list just because. It's only done that way if it makes sense given what the item writer thinks is important to measure around the skill that we've identified.
Got a great question in here from Don, who we're talking here about, and I think everyone here is interested in kind of the secret sauce behind the MCSE. And so the question is essentially one that you and I have been talking about before we started the webinar here, and that is, can you take us through the process that a question goes through from its moment of inception, so when it starts, the idea begins, all the way through to the very end where it ends up on that screen where you're taking the exam. Can you walk us through just the steps that you go through to take an idea and turn it into an actual test question?
Sure. It actually all starts with the objective domain where we define the skills. So that's where the idea starts. We have subject matter experts from around the world come. Usually we hold these sessions in Redmond. They come to Redmond for a 2.5-day session for an exam. That's about what it takes. And they essentially brainstorm what skills they think should be measured on each of our exams and what skills should be measured across a certification. And then once we know what skills we're going to measure, the next step then is to actually do what's called the blueprint survey, where we determine how important that content in each of those skills is. So we actually have another set of subject matter experts. We do it through a survey who will actually go in and look at each of the skills and tell us how important it is to be measured on the exam and how frequently it is performed on a job. And then using those two pieces of information, we can actually decide how many items or questions we're going to ask around each of the skills. So once we know what the skill is and once we know how many questions we're going to actually write to each of those skills, we then we work with a content development vendor who works with subject matter experts to actually write that content. And I would say item writing is probably the most difficult phase of exam development. It's easy to look at a question that's already been written and say, wow, this question is just terrible. It's much more difficult to look at the skill that we're asking them to write a question to, look at the blank computer screen with the little cursor flashing at you and think, how am I going to ask a good question meeting Microsoft's guidelines and requirements around that we have in place around our questions, and that's going to be a good measure of someone's skills. It's a very difficult, challenging process, which is why we have multiple phases of review that follow. So once the item writer actually writes the question, and the model that vendors use in terms of how they write questions can vary, but in general, it's something to the effect where item writers are assigned objectives where they're really strong, where their skills and strengths are, in those content areas that they know. They will write an item. It gets submitted to a lead item writer who will review the question, provide feedback to the item writer who initially wrote it. They'll kind of go back and forth until they get the item in a good enough place where they feel comfortable that they can take it to the next phase, which is called the alpha or technical review. In this phase, a different set of subject matter experts actually will review the items. And let me step back about the item writing. We actually have subject matter experts in Microsoft Technology write the items versus subject matter experts in item writing write the items. So these are people who really do know the technology who are writing the items for us, and not somebody who doesn't know anything about the technology who's trying to write the items. So we actually take the approach that it's better to have subject matter experts in the technology write the content and train them on item writing versus the other way. But once we have a good item, or what we think is a good item, we take it through an alpha or technical review where another set of subject matter experts will review the item. They will ask themselves questions like, does this actually measure the objective? Is it measuring the skill we want it to be measuring? Is it technically accurate? Is the correct answer really what we see as the correct answer? Is there a correct answer? Is it clear? So all of those questions are part of that review of the technical review of the item to make sure it's as good as it can possibly be. And by having someone other than the item writer look at it, it's a fresh set of eyes to make sure that it's mapping back to the content domain the way we want it to. Then there's yet another phase that follows around the quality of the item, and that's called the beta period, where we actually will then administer the exam to candidates and ask and get their feedback. Not only how are they performing psychometrically, but what comments do they have. Once we have that data, I can look to see if the item is performing the way I want it to from a psychometric perspective, and we can also make sure that there aren't any issues that candidates are identifying for us. So after it goes through beta, then it goes through yet another process for a quality review, which we call item selection. So the items that are kind of outside my psychometric boundaries in terms of what I consider too easy or too difficult, if it seems like it's too easy or if it seems like it's too difficult or if it's not, doesn't look like it's differentiating between high and low performers, I will talk to another set of subject matter experts about those items and figure out what's going on, if something needs to change or if something is, if it's okay, it's just too new right now. So we need to just give it time because once it becomes ingrained, it will change the psychometric performance of the item. And then I also talk to subject matter experts about those comments. Remember I said I want to know, is the item technically accurate? Is there a correct answer? Is there more than one correct answer? All of those kinds of comments I talk to subject matter experts about to confirm if there's an issue or not and if it can be fixed. And then once we have all that information, I make a final decision on what stays in the item pool. And then those items are used to actually create the form that is administered when you go to sit the exam. Depending on the run rate of the exam, then I will actually do that same thing quarterly, twice a year, or once a year. Every exam that we have that has a run rate of at least 1,000 people or more take it a year, I will look at the psychometric performance at least yearly. If it's got higher run rates where more people are taking it, I'll look at the psychometric performance more frequently. So this is not just a Microsoft way of developing items and exams. This is actually industry best practices on how you ensure that you have a valid and reliable exam in market.
You bring up some really interesting points here about how you've got the people who are in the field working with the products, or in some cases the people who are actually writing the questions. And this actually brings up a good point. And Andrew, I'm gonna also paraphrase the question that you've brought up that has to do with some of the more, he uses the word obscure PowerShell commands, but some of the more kind of non-standard PowerShell commands that we are beginning to see in this current generation of MCSE and other exams, which the prevalence of some of these maybe very product-specific PowerShell commands in this generation perhaps goes at odds a bit with what the PowerShell people are telling us, which is just use discoverability to find the commands. Can you talk a bit about the decision-making process that goes into determining if a command line tool is something that would be tested against, or what are the decisions that are made when it comes time to going from a GUI-based question to a more PowerShell-based question?
So I am not technical enough to be able to answer this probably in the detail that the people on the phone would like, but let me just give you an overview of some of the thought process. Again, the item writer would look at the skill that's being measured, and if they thought that it was something that a PowerShell command in that kind of format would make sense, then that's probably where they're going to gravitate towards in the item writing process. But in terms of putting those commands, there's a couple of comments that I just want to make. And this not only applies to PowerShell, but also applies to some of the developer stuff. Yes, there's discoverability, there's IntelliSense and things like that, but there is some level of knowledge that you should have around PowerShell commands, around just writing code that would get you started so you know what to look for in terms of IntelliSense or in terms of discoverability, right? You have to know where to start. You can't just, it's not just going to automatically populate what has to happen. You have to kind of, even in IntelliSense, you have to start typing the first few characters before something pops up in the window for you to select from. So you have to be able to recognize and know at least enough to get started, and that's kind of what we're trying to measure with some of this stuff without an ability to include IntelliSense and similar functionality on our exams when we're talking about PowerShell code or just developer code. So that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is to assess your ability to know where you're supposed to start so that you can recognize it. And that being said, I know that sometimes we have item writers that just are mean, quite honestly, and I have seen items that are tricky, and I don't want tricky items on our exam. So if you do see obscure PowerShell code in their commands, and you're like, why is Microsoft testing this? And you go back and you look at the objective domain and you just can't see why we would have possibly be testing you or asking you that question, you need to let us know, because we can't review every single item that appears on an exam. We trust our content development vendors in the alpha process and our beta process to catch some of these things. And sometimes items get through that really shouldn't have gotten through. But we need you to tell us when that happens. And you can do that through commenting on the exam, or you can actually escalate through our exam escalation process. So if you go to Microsoft.com/learning website and search and click on certification and exams, you'll see a link to some FAQs. There's actually on that page, towards the top half of the page, there's a process that you can go through to actually challenge a question or escalate an issue. So if you forgot to comment on it during the exam, or if you want an actual response from Microsoft, because I can't actually respond to all the people who comment, then I would encourage you to go through that escalation process, and we will look into it. And if the item shouldn't be on the exam, or if our planner decides that PowerShell command is too obscure, we will fix it and we'll take it off. So I just want to get two messages here: is keep in mind that with the PowerShell stuff and with developer code, even though we can't provide you the functionality you have around discoverability and IntelliSense and all those other things, we should be writing the item at a level where you should at least know where to start, and that's what we're testing, is that you know where to go to look for, and you would recognize it if you saw it, essentially. And then if you still think that it's beyond the scope of the exam, it's obscure, things like that, please let us know either by commenting on it and or by doing an escalation or a challenge so that we can look into it.
So you heard it here first. There are mechanisms. If you find a question you just don't feel is fair, there are a variety of mechanisms actually to at least get another pair of eyes on that question. If you feel like one just doesn't really do a good job of testing an appropriate amount of knowledge. That actually brings me to a question I have, and it has to do with just how you go about designing new question types. So in the earliest of days, we had multiple choice, and then we got into more of these nastier question types like multi-choice, and then the build, list, and order types, which are ones that I think all of us really enjoy. I know even you had blogged recently on your blog about a new question type called an assertion reason question type. Can you talk a bit about the science behind how question types get designed and how they ultimately make their way into what we see on the screen?
So actually, it works. We are constantly looking for new and different ways to assess skills on our exams. First, we want to just explore different ways, because we might be able to measure knowledge and skills more effectively through different item formats, and so that's kind of what we're looking for. But we also people find multiple choice questions kind of boring, and they don't really like to do just click through exams like that. At least that's the general feedback. I look at the satisfaction with our exams and things like that, and what I found is that questions that are only multiple choice item types, people are less satisfied with those than they are with when we have more diverse number of item types on the exam. So we kind of also want to keep people interested. I want to say fun, but I said fun in that blog post, and wow, the reaction was pretty negative to that. So what I meant by fun was more, it was fun in a challenging way, so that when you took it and you got done, regardless of whether you passed or failed, you felt like you actually accomplished something and you did something. That's what I meant by fun. I didn't really mean it like game-like fun. So that's the other part of it, is we want to keep people just kind of feel the challenge of the exam and measure skills in a different way. So we are constantly looking at what other organizations who do testing are doing in terms of assessing the skills or knowledge that they're in their content domains. So with the assertion reason, this actually comes from, as you can imagine, college entry types of exams like GMAT and GREs and things like that. So that's kind of where the idea came from. But ultimately, it's our content development managers and me going out and just doing research on what are the new ways people are measuring skills. Are there ways that we might be able to leverage that for our own certification program? Once we've done some research and figuring out what different item types we might want to experiment with, we do some additional research with people internal to Microsoft. We talk to our planners, who actually are kind of the visionaries for what skills and abilities will be included on our exams, and kind of putting the boundaries on what we're trying to create in this, within an exam. What are the walls around within which we're operating? And we will talk to them and say, hey, here's this new item type that we're considering. Do you see that this has any applicability within the certification exams that you're envisioning? And sometimes they say no. Sometimes they're like, I can't see how this will possibly ever work for this in this area. How could we use this to measure skills? And so if they don't see any use for it or potential application, then the conversation pretty much ends right there. Sometimes they'll say, I see a use for this, but I only think it would work for our MCSE exams or MCSA exams or for our MTA technical associate exams. And so we kind of just start to get a feel for, is there a fit for that item type within our organization? Once we have an idea that it's actually something that we might be able to use on a certification exam, we'll actually do some more kind of limited research with some subject matter experts to get a feel for, are the instructions clear? How would this work from a global perspective? Are we going to be worried about English as a second language? How will this translate? So start to get some feel for the ability to actually deliver this around the world, across languages, and the clarity of the instructions and those kinds of key concerns that we might have around, will people understand what's being asked of them when we put this item type on an exam? Once we feel like we have a pretty solid base for what this item type will look like, its purpose, where we would likely use it, then we will post it. I'll post it to Born to Learn, and I want some feedback from the general audience and population to get a feel for what people think of it in general. Now, with the assertion reason item type, the feedback was largely negative. Let's just say that. But
is it ever positive?
We did get a few people who saw that there was some value in it. I think people are really struggling with the instructions and things like that, and worried about the fact that Microsoft we tend to write wordy questions, and it might get confusing. And so all of this is really good feedback in how we ultimately will design and then pilot test the item. So for all you naysayers out there, I still am going to try to pilot test this item. So the next phase of this is actually to have our content development vendors actually try to write items using that item format. So we're actually in that phase with assertion reason right now. We've handed off some exams for sustainment, and I've asked our content development vendor to write a few of these items to see if they can do it. So that's the next step, right, so we get some feedback. I took all that feedback, and I've now created some guidance on how I want these items to be written. The item writers will try to write them, and they may come back and say, this is really hard, we can't do it, or this doesn't work in this content domain, or it could be any wide range of feedback. And so, again, if the item writers can't write it, clearly that's the end of the life of that particular item format. But if they can write it, then the next step would be for me to actually put it on an exam and a pilot test. So when these items appear on an exam, I will be gathering feedback around the psychometric performance. I'll be looking at the comments, and I will just be seeing if they actually are working the way I would like them to work and doing what we hopefully wanted them to do when we started the whole conversation around including a particular item type on an exam and pilot testing it. So we will look at the comments and the psychometrics to see, is it actually a viable item? Is it something we want to keep? This is, whenever we release new item types and we have these conversations, keep in mind that any particular item type is not going to be the only item type that appears on an exam, with the exception of a multiple choice exam, because there are some exams that will continue to be only multiple choice in its variants. But with something like assertion reason, when you sit an exam, there might be 2 or 3 of those on your exam. So it's not like we're saying we're going to get rid of all the item types and go to a completely assertion reason exam. What we're saying is we just want to have another item type in our arsenal with which our item writers might be able to use to help measure content and skills and knowledge in a different way but do it in something that, and it might be a better way for certain content.
So for the 1,000 people that we've got signed up for this webinar, and these people that have spent an hour of their time learning about this MCSE, can you just give us the answer to one test question? Just one.
The answer is always C.
Actual question. And actually, this is one that David asked. Are there plans to add more lab-type exams?
So that is actually what I was mentioning earlier around the performance-based testing. We are trying to figure it out, and it is one of our commitments this year to figure out a strategy for how we're going to get more what we're calling experiential validation into the certification process. And so the challenge that we've had with lab-based exams in particular and emulations is that our global delivery and the fact that we can't put our systems in all the test centers, and so what it requires is some connection to the internet, to a server that hosts the software so that you guys can interact with it and then perform the tasks. And although that works relatively well in the United States, there are certain parts of the world where it doesn't work as well, and I have to consider the user experience around this when we make decisions about how we deliver our exam. And if you remember back, maybe it must have been about 5 years ago, we did the emulations on 640, which is a Windows Server exam. And we were really excited, and people, and like I said, I'm always looking for feedback, and I had a survey on satisfaction with the quality of the exam, and when we announced that we were going to do this, people were just loving it. They're like, this is the best thing ever. Then we did it, and we launched it around the world, and people had some horrible experiences with mouse lag and latency and all this other stuff, and sometimes dropped connections with the internet depending on where you're at, and the satisfaction plummeted well below where it was before we even implemented the performance-based testing. So when we took it out then, the satisfaction with the exam went back up, and it just kind of shows that we should only do it if we can do it well. So what we're trying to figure out is how we can do it well and make sure everyone has a good experience in this with a performance-based or lab-type question. We have, you may not know this, but we're trying to think a little bit differently about this experiential notion in terms of validation. And we do have one certification you can earn where you can actually do a Windows app and get credit for some exams that are in that path. So we call it the App to Certification or Cert to App program. And if you go out to the blog and you look for Larry's blogs on this, he's been talking about it. I can't remember the exact certification it's for, but essentially if you create a Windows app, it replaces, you don't have to take two of the exams in the exam path. It's 481 and 482, I think. Don't quote me on that, but just search for Cert to App or App to Cert on the blog, and Larry Kea, and you will find more information on it. But that's what we're trying to think outside the box around some of this experiential validation stuff. So you might not actually go to a test center to do the lab-based portion of your exam. You might do something else. And with the developer audience, it's a little bit easier because we can say, well, develop an app for the store. And then there's a process for the app to get accepted and things like that. And there's a review process. And then when you do that, you can earn credit for some exams rather than having to sit them. So how do we apply that in the IT pro world? We're working on it.
Another of the questions I think that a lot of people have is perhaps something that Microsoft has maybe added a little bit of confusion in there on purpose, and that has to do with the scoring of exams. So I think trying to understand what you scored and how that relates to maybe the percentage number of questions you got right is something that seems to be purposely obfuscated for one reason or another. Can you talk a bit about the decisions that were made, or what was the thinking that went into the actual scoring that we're seeing now, and how is that scaled? And just tell us a bit more about what we're actually seeing when we get our score report.
So in terms of the score report, we use scaled scores, and this is actually an industry best practice. Oh, by the way, I see David Williams has commented it's the App Review to Cert pilot program. So to answer the previous question, thank you, David. To your question now. So the score reports and the score that you get, we do what's called scaled scoring, and that is actually an industry best practice. And the reason we do it is because we want you to be able to know if your performance has improved over time. So all of our technical certifications are scaled so that the cut score is 700. So the raw score behind that can vary, and it may be a different percent, and it is a different percent of correct answers across exams. And I'll talk about why it might be a different percent in just a minute, but let me talk about the scaled score process first. With scaling, we do that because what happens is when we republish exams, the percent of items you have to answer correctly may change based on the difficulty of the items that you see. So if you sit the exam on one day and you see an easier set of items, you will have to answer a higher percentage of those questions correctly than if you sat the exam on another day and you saw a more difficult set of questions. Doesn't it seem fair? I mean, isn't it more fair that if I see easier questions, I should have to answer more of them correctly than if I see a set of difficult questions? And so as a result, if I just provided you a score and said, here's the percent of questions you answered correctly, if you saw, let's just imagine you saw an easier set of questions the first time and you got 60% of those right. And then the next time you take the exam, you saw a more difficult set and you answered 50% of those correctly. So if you're just looking at percentages, you'd say, wow, my performance went down, right? But I saw a more difficult set, so did I maybe do better? Well, with scaled scores, you actually may have done better because the more difficult set, we don't expect you to have to answer as many of those correctly because they're more difficult. So by scaling scores, it allows you to see how your performance is changing over time regardless of the difficulty of the content that you saw. So it just makes those kinds of comparisons easier. And if I would argue that if you ever take an exam where you're getting the percent that you answered correctly and you have to take it multiple times, I would go to that testing program and say, how are you making sure that I'm seeing the same level of difficulty in each of these administrations so that I know that the percent of questions that I answered correctly are comparable from one exam attempt to the next? And are you applying the same cut score if you're looking at percent positive? The percent answered correctly. Because, again, how is that fair if I saw a more difficult version of the questions at one administration versus the next? So that's why we do scaled scores. I guess it is obfuscated in some ways because I'm not providing the exact number that you answered correctly, but I actually think I'm providing you better and more valuable information by sharing the scaled score versus a percent of questions you answered correctly. Now, how do we decide where the cut score is going to be set and why might it change based on the difficulty? All of that and why does it vary from one exam to the next? It all goes back to who the audience profile, what the audience looks like, what experiences do we have, and how does that relate to the items that we see in the item pool? So if we have certain expectations of the candidate population that we have defined in the audience profile. What our subject matter experts do who help us set the cut score is they look at those requirements, those skills and experiences. They look at the items in the item pool and they say, how smart do you have to be to answer those questions correctly? How much experience and how well does that map back to what we've said the experiences are for the target audience? Considering who is the minimally qualified candidate, that is the person who should barely pass this exam, where should we put the cut score? So they're taking the audience profile and the skills and abilities required there, looking at the actual content that we have created to assess those skills and saying, at what level do I have to be for that minimally qualified candidate? What level do I have to be to barely pass this exam? In some cases, we might have item pools that are a little bit more difficult for who we see as the minimally qualified candidate for that exam. As a result, you'll have to answer a fewer number of questions correctly to pass the exam. The flip can happen as well, right? We could write a little slightly easier content for that target audience, and so you will have to answer a higher proportion of the questions correctly to pass. So it's because we don't arbitrarily set the cut score, because we involve subject matter experts who carefully review the audience profile and the expectations of the target of who we really want to have the certification in conjunction with the difficulty of the item pool, we'll have variations on where the cut score will be set from one exam to the next. And then in addition to that, we add another layer potentially is then we apply that cut score to the actual items that are delivered and we will adjust the cut score if it's too difficult. If the items are too difficult or more difficult, the cut score is actually a little bit lower than a set of items that might be easier. So it's actually a subject matter expert-driven process and where we set the cut score, but what I'm trying to do with the scaled scores is really make sure you understand how your performance might change from one attempt to the next.
One of the questions that popped in, which is a relatively good one, but I think you've already explained it, was do you have like a set amount of a set pass rate or a goal for the pass rate for the exam? But it sounds like what you're describing is not so much that you have a goal for the pass rate, you have a goal for the minimally qualified candidate. So this candidate is the person that should be able to pass the exam, and so we write that exam so that that person, based off of those credentials, should be able to pass it. Am I right?
Correct. Yeah.
I have one more
I
question
always
here.
get this.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I do get the question about what's the passing rate for exams. I get that a lot. And the passing rate is such a bad way to know how good or bad an exam is. It's really a poor indicator of quality. But even internally, I get this question all the time, and I get it from candidates. So I just want to mention that we don't share passing rates because they're so easily misinterpreted. If I told you the pass rate for an exam was 70%, there will be someone out there who says that's too high, too many people are passing. And there will be someone out there who will say that's too low, not enough people are passing. So it really depends on your perspective. And it doesn't matter what passing rate I give you. There's always going to be people who think it's too high or too low. But more importantly, the passing rate is really based on the set of candidates who are taking the exam. If we have done a good job of describing what skills and abilities are needed to pass the exam in the target audience and in the objective domain, shouldn't the passing rate be high because the people know what is expected of them and only those people who are taking the exam are the ones that should be taking the exam? So if you're qualified, shouldn't you pass? And if we have more people who are qualified who are taking the exam, shouldn't the pass rate be higher? So it's just think about that the pass rate is it really is a bad indicator about the quality of an exam simply because it's easily misinterpreted, and if we've done a good job of defining the skills, people will self-select out of the process until they're ready to sit the exam, and once you're qualified, shouldn't you pass? Thus, you would have a higher passing rate for an exam. If I have a low passing rate, then is it because there's something wrong with the exam, or is it the wrong set of people taking it? And so a lot of times it turns out it's the wrong set of people taking it. But if I go and share that passing rate information with someone, they will be like, oh, something's wrong with the exam. Maybe, but more importantly is who's taking it, what skills and abilities do they have, and should they be passing? If they shouldn't, then a low passing rate is exactly what I want.
It sounds like in a perfect world, the whole point of an exam is to prove that you know what you assert that you know. And so in a perfect world, a person who meets that minimum criteria would pass it every time because they do know what the exam intends for them to know. So I can see where the self-selection process is important, so people recognize, taking the exam should be kind of the latter step in the process. After I really, truly get to know the technology, understand it, and really get to use it in production.
Right.
I have another question here for you, and I don't know if this is a good question for you or not, but it's one that's been asked a number of times here in the list. Can you provide any guidance for people to better prepare for the exam?
The best guidance I can tell you is to actually get experience using the technology. And so what I would recommend is that you go and you look at the objective domain, go to the prep guide where we list all the skills that are going to be measured, and then walk through each of the skills and actually do them if you can, either at work or if you can install the software at home, wherever it is, and whenever you can, actually perform the skill that we have listed there. So practice, practice, practice is the best piece of information because the more experience you have with the technology, the more you're going to be prepared for the exam. And even if you haven't specifically encountered a problem that we have in an exam question, if you have enough experience, you should be able to extrapolate from that experience and figure out how to solve that problem. So I get a lot of comments like, I've never done this, or this is something we would never do. Well, probably it almost shouldn't matter in some ways, because if you have enough experience and you know the skills, that you should be able to apply that knowledge and extend beyond your own experiences and to answer those questions because you have the foundational knowledge to do so. And then what I would also suggest is we have a list of preparation resources on all of our associated with all of our exams. So I would look at those. And keep in mind, though, that training is a good first step, but we don't have these are certification exams, so they are not directly tied to the content that's covered in training. Training will get you started, but it's not exam prep exactly. Because we want to maintain a certification, which by definition is an independent evaluation of skills. And the minute we tie it to training content, then it's no longer an independent evaluation of skills. And as a result, there isn't a one-to-one alignment between training and the exam, but there should be an alignment between what's kind of the objectives that we cover in our training and the objectives that are covered on the exam.
I think that's worth repeating. The training side of Microsoft and the certification side of Microsoft are two different entities. And so the training is not the certification, and the certification is not the training. That definitely bears repeating, I think. Because you hear that all the time from people who have sat in a class and said, oh, wait a minute, the exam is orthogonal to the what I learned in the training class. And that's I guess, by design.
It is by design, although we do hear what candidates are saying, and they do want more information in terms of preparation and the best way to do it. So that's another thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how can we better align our courseware and our training and preparation materials with our exam while still maintaining this notion of independence so that somebody doesn't have to take training to pass the exam, and by taking training alone is a good start, but not necessarily sufficient for passing the exam. So that's one of the big projects that we've been working on internally to Microsoft is that we do hear what candidates are saying about creating a better, closer alignment, but how do I do that within this requirement of maintaining independence so we continue to have a certification program and not a certificate program? I know it's a nuance of words, but within the industry, the difference is a certification is an independent measure of your skills, and a certificate is one that is directly tied to training. And so we want a certification program, not a certificate program.
So I have two final questions for you then. The first of which is from Grady here. He says, you've received a bachelor in psychology. You have a master's and a PhD in organizational industrial psychology with minors in quantitative psychology and human resource management from my alma mater. Do you play chess? And if so, what is your rating?
I don't play chess. I'm not really much into that thing. I'm too busy baking, quite honestly, to play chess.
So the statistics does not make its way into the home life.
Well, you know how it makes its way into my home life is I never follow recipes exactly.
Uh-huh.
And so that's, I guess, do you think about when you start thinking about numbers differently in recipes and the proportion of ingredients and those ratios and things, I think that's how it makes it into my, because I've never followed a recipe exactly.
So last question then. I know that, first of all, thank you so much. And I think on behalf of everyone in the audience, this has been just enlightening. I myself have learned a lot out of this discussion that we've had today. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you. I know that you are a very rapid, very consummate blogger. I know that you have a place online where you go and post all the updated, what's going on in the certification industry. Can you share any of that information with us so that we know where to go?
So I blog on Born to Learn. So if you go to borntolearn.net, I think is the URL. So that's where you can find me. I also am, I do a little bit of tweeting, but not a lot. So you can follow me there. Whenever I blog about something, I do tweet it out so that my followers know. I don't have many followers, so please follow me. That would be cool.
And what is your Twitter handle?
Liberty Munson.
So you heard it here, Liberty Munson. And if there's one thing to be learned from this presentation is that Microsoft is absolutely paying attention to the comments that you're submitting, the information that you're providing from them, and the entire experience is definitely a two-way street. At least that's what I'm taking away from this presentation. So thank you also for that. Also want to thank Pluralsight too for sponsoring this webinar. Drop by pluralsight.com where we've got some exam-oriented training that's being populated up there right now. So feel free to drop by there. Again, Liberty, thank you so very much for your time today. And with that, I will turn things back over to Lindsay for some closing thoughts. Lindsay?
Thanks, Greg, and thank you, Liberty. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today and for participating. We didn't have time to get through everyone's questions, so feel free to tweet about them with hashtag Pluralsight Live. You can also email your questions or your comments and feedback to webinars@pluralsight.com. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.